Well, in the national debate over gun violence, both sides seem to agree that we need to pay more attention to people suffering from mental health problems. But in fact, just how clear is the connection between being diagnosed as mentally ill and the urge to use a gun on someone else? Few of us understand the psychology, but our next guest is someone who spent a lot of time thinking about what, sadly, has become one of the hallmarks of American culture today: gun violence. Dr. Jonathan Metzl is a professor of sociology and psychiatry at Vanderbilt University and the director of the university's Center for Medicine, Health, and Society. And we're honored to welcome him to BK Live today. Welcome, Doctor.
Thanks so much. It's really nice to be here.
Thank you. So to get things started, when we have these incidents that are all too common, lone wolf is a lot of the verbiage that we hear, silent, sort of outsider guy. So I'm interested if all of those perceptions sort of hamper our ability to prevent gun violence.
Well, that's a great question to start with, and I'd say that there are two kind of issues at play. So there is the question of mass shootings, and there's the question of everyday gun violence. So mass shootings, of course, are moments of national tragedy. All of a sudden, we're all paying attention. They're moments of terror in a way because previously safe spaces like schools or movie theaters all of a sudden become unsafe. And at those moments, understandably, I think, there's a focus on the individual shooter. And so all of a sudden we say, how could we have stopped this one mass shooting? And understandably, of course, we then focus on the psychology of the mass shooter. And so from a psychiatric perspective, it makes sense at those times that we do some kind of psychological profile. And statistics show that at least 60% or more of people who commit those mass shootings have some kind of complex psychological background, psychiatric background, that may have partially contributed to this question. The problem we get into that I try to show in my research is that when we use that narrative to then try to address all gun crime in the United States, we make a huge problem because we have 33,000 gun deaths on average a year in the United States. And in everyday gun violence, people with mental illness, which is what I study, are far more likely to be the victims of violence than the perpetrators of violence. And so in a way, we could take away guns from everybody diagnosed with mental illness in the United States, and we really wouldn't make a dent in everyday gun violence except for lowering the suicide rate, which is very, very important.
So I know New York City's First Lady, Chirlane McCray, has been on the front lines of sort of destigmatizing mental illness, and there's an initiative that the de Blasio administration is undertaking where they would have folks screening. It's a test where they're putting $30 million into a plan to sort of buffer front line where they're going to train mental health staffers in social service organizations. So people who don't have PhDs like you are going to be sort of assessing folks. Do you think that putting them on the front lines is going to make a difference, or is a good use of $30 million bucks?
Well, I think that certainly we need more mental health services, and so I'm very strongly in support of anything that destigmatizes mental illness or anything that enhances services. We've cut away the safety net for people who need it the most. And in that regard, just leaving guns out of the question, I would say that we really badly need more mental health services. At the same time, I don't think it's going to make a dent in gun violence. And the reason I say that is because there is no psychiatric diagnosis whose symptom is harming somebody else or shooting somebody else. And ironically, all mental health practitioners are notoriously ineffective at predicting which one of their patients, which one of the people they see is going to go on to shoot somebody. And it kind of makes sense because psychiatrists, for example, see many hundreds of people a week who threaten some kind of violence. I'm angry at my mother, I'm angry at my boss. If they had to hospitalize every one of those patients, we wouldn't really have a traffic problem in New York. Yeah, exactly. but other than that, so in a way, it's just a numbers game. We can't really predict who's going to commit a violent act. So again, I think it's important for mental health services, but not for predicting gun violence.
So I know you have a book where you talk about these sort of overarching mental labels that are put on people like schizophrenia as they apply to men of color in particular, and you're concerned with that sort of intersection of race and mental health and how it's been used to stigmatize an entire segment of the population. So looking at that, you talked about the split between these sort of individual tragedies versus a sort of structural sort of impediment to folks getting mental health services and being characterized as these shooters.
Right.
So the question in all of that is, how do we approach the sort of racist angle that's apparent in so much of the everyday gun violence versus these lone wolf, it happened in Sandy Hook things?
Right. Well, that's a wonderful question, actually, and there are two parts of that. On one hand, leaving race aside just for 1 second, there are many other factors that can help us prevent or predict gun violence. They're not mental illness. So, for example, alcohol and drugs present at a moment of interpersonal interaction or altercation raises the risk of a shooting if there's a gun there by 5 or 7%. That's important because in many states like Tennessee, where I live, you can have loaded handguns in bars. A very, very bad idea.
Yeah.
A past history of violence is very important in predicting gun violence, and that's important because if somebody has a history of domestic abuse, for example, you really don't want them to have a firearm because they're more likely to use that again.
Yeah.
Access to firearms. So part of what I argue in my work is that there are many other factors we can look at other than mental illness, and those are factors that don't specifically say the other. They're about us. They're about our everyday interactions. And so I think on one hand, it's important to pay attention to those.
Yeah.
In relation to race, the book you mentioned that I wrote is called The Protest Psychosis. And I look at the kind of historical trajectory and how we kind of blame people with mental illness and how we kind of fear them. And it's interesting to note, for example, as you say, that, for example, in the aftermath of many shootings today, we tell this lone wolf story. We did that after Adam Lanza. We did it after the shooting in Oregon. And that's important because many of these people are, in fact, lone wolves.
Why are so many of them white?
Yeah, well, that's kind of the issue, is that the stories, so there are many, many shootings in the United States. There's a particular terror that we have when it's a white-on-white crime, or when the victims are white, or things like that. And so part of it is the sensational story of what kind of crimes get reported. And then I think that there is a kind of historical lesson here, which is that, for example, in my book, I looked at the 1960s and 1970s, and at that time, Americans were very concerned about guns, but they weren't concerned about lone wolves. They were concerned about people like Malcolm X and Robert Williams, Hugh Newton, all that kind of thing. And at that time, when ironically people in the Black Panthers, for example, were making an argument very similar to what the Tea Party makes today, which is it's our constitutional right to defend ourselves. But when that was the case, American culture didn't say it's a lone wolf. What they said was it's black culture that's pathological. We have to fear black culture. And so what I show is at that time, it wasn't like let's fear the individual crazy person. It was, let's fear all black people. And that led to a bunch of different issues, but part of it was the NRA and other organizations supported gun control in 1968. In the present day, when it's a mass shooting, again, a horrible, tragic incident, you never hear, we need to limit guns to all white people, even though that would be kind of the 1970s logic.
So looking, I know,
lots to say about that
for a second. That would be some interesting legislation. But looking at an organization like the NRA, how much stock do they put into folks like you getting to the psychology of it when we even hear people who want to be the president saying we need more guns? If other people had guns, we would have less gun violence.
Yeah, well, that's factually untrue, but I think that part of the issue for me is that you'll see in the aftermath of many mass shootings that conservative politicians, and particularly the NRA, really pushed this mental illness story. And so, for example, they say it's not a gun problem, it's a mental illness problem. People like Ann Coulter say guns don't kill people, the mentally ill do. And part of why they further that narrative is not because they're arguing for more mental health treatment, even though that would be great and I would support that. It's because that's a form of stigma. And so we can say basically, oh, it's not about them, it's not about us, it's about them. It's about this other kind of stigmatized group. And in a way, what it does is it limits us looking at this bigger picture of everyday gun violence in the United States. And so I really think that even though I'm a psychiatrist, I really think we need to reject the narrative of mental illness and say, what are the societal factors that lead us not just to shoot each other, but to mistrust each other to the point where we need guns in the first place?
Can we talk about the societal factors that can lead to mental illness? Because if we're talking about the lone wolf person who goes and steals his mom's guns and 20 students die at their desks, it's different than the person who's raised in an environment where they've been hearing gunshots at the same time as a lullaby, and they've been raised in a war zone.
Right.
So that has to affect you mentally.
There's a lot of research now, for example, in Chicago, where there's a lot of kind of everyday gun violence. Right. And the rates of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder,
in a city
soar because, I mean, if you think about what PTSD is, they almost invented the diagnosis in Vietnam with airplane pilots, soldiers, who the more they were in the theater, the more they thought they were going to die, the more they had risk of PTSD. People in Chicago live with fear of death every second. And
continually. It's not something they're coming home from. It's their home environment.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And so partially when we talk about mental illness and guns, the untold story is the mental illness we're producing by having so many guns in our society. And certainly these areas are a great example of that.
So if we roll back the stigma, what can folks who are everyday and don't have a mental health diagnosis, is there a marching order for them?
Well, you know, I talk to a lot of groups on all sides of this debate, so I do a lot of speaking also to pro-gun groups. And I think that there really is a need right now to forge some centrist position. It's hard because there's so much extremism. Right. And I think there's also a lot of learned helplessness about this, that people just, in a way, they give up and say, oh my gosh, there's nothing we can do in a particular way. And I think that that's, in a way, is what we're trying to fight against, and say that actually there are everyday kind of common sense things that we can do, like background checks, even gun owners, many gun owners support background checks, you know, closing loopholes at gun shows for people who can just buy guns or on the internet. So I think there are common sense things that people who are in the middle, and again, I don't think anybody's talking about overturning the Second Amendment, but I think that, you know, in a way, the framers of the Constitution would be kind of upset right now if they saw what was being done in their name. And so it really is, the question is finding a middle ground now that people can gravitate toward, because nobody wants this kind of chaos that we're having.
Do you give any credence to the idea that these mass shootings are sort of copycat, or now that the sort of floodgates have opened, depending on when you became cognizant, whether you were Klebold and Harris, or if you just found out at Sandy Hook, if these people are following some kind of script?
Well, a colleague of mine and I had an article in the American Journal of Public Health a couple of months ago that I'd be free to send out to anybody who wants that. But we looked at the history of mass shootings in the United States, and basically I think that mass shooters are very aware, particularly this particular demographic.
Place in history.
Yeah, and angry, disempowered white men who end up committing many of these crimes. And so just to say it straight, it's harder to get on television anymore because, like in the 80s, if you shot one person, it was a national tragedy. Oh my God, how could this happen? Now you've got to do something more spectacular than the other mass shooter. And we see this, for example, in Oregon. There have been roughly 10 or 11 school shootings since the Oregon shooting, but nobody really heard about them because they weren't spectacular in nature. And so I think there's a strong copycat phenomenon here that plays.
So would that copycat phenomenon explain the 40% who aren't being diagnosed as sort of mentally, who had mental health problems? Earlier you said like 60% of these shooters typically are mentally diagnosed as having some kind of deficiency. Well, so are those 40 the copycats?
Well, to be clear, I think mental illness is one factor in mass shootings, but I think there are many other factors, and so I don't think that mental illness directly explains it. And the other issue is the diagnoses that we end up giving many of these shooters aren't linked to gun violence. So for example, there's a lot of talk about autism and Asperger's now. There's no literature about if you have Asperger's, you're more likely to shoot somebody. And so mental illness is one factor, but really at the end of the day, the question is really access to guns and a bunch of other factors. So mental illness is just one factor. So I think there are many things that play into this.
Well, I think we've only scratched the surface. We'll continue to watch you on your appearances on the other air.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
But how can folks read up and find out about your publications, schedule, and your books?
Well, so my website is just jonathanmetzl.com, and it's got access to all my materials on this topic. And I'm also doing a lot of activism in the South, trying to create kind of common cause communities, and so people can learn about it there as well.
How's that going?
Again, I think that nobody wants what's happening now. I really think that even though it's very polarized, nobody wants this kind of death. And so I think that I think that there's a need for a middle ground now, and hopefully we'll be able to find it.
All right, thanks for joining us.
My
Dr.
pleasure. Thanks so
Netzel.
much.